The blue tie lay on the dresser next to the white shirt I had ironed the night before. The habit of doing everything in advance had remained from the days when I had to get up at 5 in the morning and travel across Portland to the construction site. Now there was no need to rush, but keeping things in order helped me stay clear-headed. And today I would need it more than ever. The Carter and Associates corporate party had been held every December at the same Grand Plaza Hotel for 27 years in a row. I started the tradition when the firm consisted of me, two engineers, and Dorothy, the secretary, who typed and made coffee in a Turkish coffee pot. Now the company had more than 100 employees. We had offices in 3 states, and the secretaries had long since been replaced by young managers with tablets and wireless headphones. Putting on my shirt, I looked in the mirror at my gray hair and wrinkles around my eyes. 72 is a respectable age for someone who started from scratch in the 80s. Back then, no one believed that a guy from a working-class neighborhood could build a successful construction company. Banks refused to give me loans. Competitors laughed at me, and officials demanded bribes for every piece of paper. But I stubbornly pursued my goal, working 16 hours a day and gradually earning a reputation as a contractor who delivered projects on time and without defects. We got our first major contract to build a shopping center in the suburbs. I remember every day of those 3 months: the rain, the mud, the problems with suppliers and workers who tried to run off with half their advance payment. But we delivered the center a week ahead of schedule, and the customer was so pleased that he recommended us to his partners. That's how the real story of the company began. Kyle was born just as things were taking off. My wife Linda often said that our son brought us luck, and I readily agreed with her. The boy grew up to be smart and curious, interested in technology, often coming to my office and looking at the drawings with admiration. In high school, he was already helping out on construction sites in the summer, carrying tools, handing out materials, and listening carefully to the foreman's explanations. It seemed natural that he would follow in my footsteps. After college, Kyle officially took the position of junior engineer, although I was actually preparing him for management. He was a talented guy, quick to grasp the essence of projects and able to find common ground with his subordinates. But something between us changed after he married Tiffany. His wife came from a family that considered themselves Portland aristocracy. Her father owned a chain of restaurants. Her mother was involved in charity work and collected contemporary art. They lived in a mansion in the hills, attended social events, and looked down on new rich people like me. Tiffany had a degree in art history but had never worked, preferring to throw parties for her friends and spend money on designer clothes. At first, I hoped that his young wife would help Kyle become more confident and ambitious. Instead, she began to convince him that his father was too conservative and was hindering the development of the business. In her opinion, the company needed fresh ideas, modern working methods, and a new image. She constantly compared our firm with competitors who were supposedly more successful and promising. Kyle's mother-in-law, Cheryl Bennett, was particularly active in these conversations. A woman in her 50s with short hair and a sharp gaze. She had a master's degree in business administration and experience working in corporations. After divorcing her husband, Cheryl moved in with her daughter and son-in-law, officially to help with her grandchildren, but in reality to influence family decisions. She studied our company's financial reports and drew up a modernization plan that included a change in management. "Wesley, you've built a good company," she would say during family dinners, smiling coldly. "But times are changing. Modern business requires different approaches that you may not understand. Kyle is ready to take full responsibility." I listened to these speeches and understood that my mother-in-law was not acting in her son's best interests, but for her own ambitions. She wanted to run a serious business, but do it with someone else's hands. Kyle gradually fell under her influence, began to doubt my decisions, and openly expressed his dissatisfaction. 3 years ago, I officially handed over the position of director to him, retaining my share in the company and my seat on the board of founders. I thought it would be better for everyone. My son would have freedom of action, and I would be able to gradually step away from the business. But instead of gratitude, Kyle began to treat me as a hindrance. He avoided consulting with me, made decisions on his own, and demonstratively ignored my suggestions at meetings. Adjusting my tie, I took the gold cufflinks from the nightstand, a gift from the employees for the company's 25th anniversary. They were engraved with the words "To the best leader," which now seemed ironic. Today's corporate party was going to be another test of my patience. Traditionally, I gave a speech about the results of the year and plans for the future. But lately, Kyle had been hinting more and more that this tradition was outdated. Leaving the house, I stopped at a photo on the dresser, a picture from 30 years ago, where Kyle and I are standing near the company's first office. He was 8 years old at the time, holding a toy excavator and smiling broadly. That boy dreamed of becoming a builder, like his dad. I wonder what Kyle dreams of now, and whether he still has any of that childhood sincerity left in him. The Grand Plaza Hotel greeted me with a familiar atmosphere of pre-holiday excitement. The first guests were already gathering in the spacious lobby, company employees with their wives and husbands, all dressed up and smiling. Christmas garlands twinkled with multicolored lights, and a huge Christmas tree decorated with gold balls and silver tinsel stood at the reception desk. Every year I booked the same banquet hall on the second floor, with panoramic windows overlooking the Willamette River. "Mr. Carter," a familiar voice called out to me. It was Roger Coleman, our chief foreman, a man in his 50s with a tanned face and calloused hands. He had been with the company for 15 years, starting as a simple bricklayer, but thanks to his hard work and responsibility, he had risen to a management position. "Roger, good to see you," I replied, shaking his hand. "How are things going at the site in Beaverton?" "Everything is going according to plan, sir. Next week we'll finish laying the walls, then we'll start installing the roof. If the weather holds, we'll be ready to bring in the finishers by New Year's." Roger spoke with the special pride that is characteristic of true craftsmen. For him, each building was not just a job, but a personal achievement. I remembered when he first came to apply for a job, a young guy fresh out of the Army, with no experience, but with a sparkle in his eyes. At that time, many foremen refused to take on newbies, considering them a burden. But I decided to give him a chance, and I was right. "Great work, as always," I said. "Pass on my thanks to the guys." "I will, Mr. Carter. By the way, they are really looking forward to your speech today, especially the young guys who recently joined us. This is their first corporate event with the company." I nodded, feeling the familiar warmth of such words. It was for moments like this that it was worth putting up with all the family troubles. People remembered who had created this company, who had given them jobs and opportunities for professional growth. Their respect could not be bought with money or inherited. Going up to the second floor, I walked into the banquet hall and glanced around at the familiar surroundings. The tables were arranged in a horseshoe shape, with space left in the center for speeches, and photos of our best projects from the past year hung on the walls. Waiters in white shirts and black vests were setting out glasses and laying out napkins. Everything looked festive and cozy at the same time. The first person to notice me was Dorothy Freeman, my former secretary, who now worked in human resources. She was a woman in her 70s with gray hair pulled back into a neat bun and intelligent brown eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. She was the only person who remembered the very early days of the company, when we huddled in a rented cottage and dreamed of having our own office. "Wesley, dear," Dorothy came over and hugged me around the shoulders. "How are you? You look great." "Thanks, Dorothy. You're still as beautiful as ever. How are the grandchildren?" "They're growing by the hour, not by the day. The older one is already in college studying architecture. He says he wants to work for a construction company, like Grandpa Wesley." She laughed. We talked a little about family, work, and how the city had changed in recent years. Dorothy was one of the few people with whom I could be completely honest. She had seen all the ups and downs of the company, knew the value of every achievement, and understood my feelings without needing any explanation. Stephen Harrison, the firm's chief architect, approached us. A tall, thin man of about 45, with carefully styled dark hair and a neat beard. He always looked impeccable. Stephen had joined the company 10 years ago from a large architectural studio, bringing with him modern ideas and a fresh perspective on design. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to thank you for your support of the Lake Oswego Shopping Center project. Without your experience and connections, we would not have been able to convince the client. It was a team effort, Stephen. You created an excellent project, and I just helped sell it. Still, your authority played a decisive role. The client trusts the company precisely because he knows Wesley Carter's behind it." Those words were balm for my wounded pride. Stephen wasn't a flatterer. He said what he thought, And if even young professionals understood my role in the firm's success, why couldn't my own son see it? Gradually, the hall filled with guests, engineers with their wives, foremen with their girlfriends, managers with their families. All these people made up a large family called Carter and Associates. I knew many of them personally, remembered how they came to get a job, how they grew professionally, how they solved personal problems. The company was not just a place to earn a living, but a part of their lives. Brandon Kelly, a young engineer who had recently graduated from university, approached me with shining eyes. The guy was about 25 years old, red-haired and freckled, full of enthusiasm and ambition. He reminded me of myself in my youth, just as hungry for knowledge and ready to work around the clock to achieve his goals. "Mr. Carter, can I talk to you?" he asked somewhat timidly. "Of course, Brandon. What's on your mind?" "I wanted to thank you for taking me on at the company. I know I don't have any experience yet, but I'm trying really hard. And also, I've been reading articles about how you built the company. It's inspiring." "Thank you, young man. The main thing is not to be afraid of difficulties and always remember that we are not just building buildings, but a future for people. Every home, every office should serve for decades, bringing joy and benefit." "I understand that, sir. And I hope that someday I will be able to manage projects like you do." Talking to young employees, I felt a surge of strength and optimism. There was no cynicism or calculation in them, only a sincere desire to learn and create. Perhaps the future of the company is not as bleak as I sometimes think. Patricia Wilson, our chief accountant, approached me. She was an energetic woman in her 50s with short hair and a businesslike appearance. She had been with the company for 12 years and knew the financial side of all our projects inside out. "Mr. Carter, happy holidays," she said with a smile. "I wanted to congratulate you on this year's excellent results. Profits are up 14% compared to last year. That's a credit to the whole team, Patricia. Thank you for your work. You know, the employees really appreciate that you always make time to talk to everyone. Not all managers do that." I nodded, understanding the hint. Kyle had indeed become more distant in his communication with his subordinates. He preferred to delegate such tasks to middle managers, considering direct communication with rank-and-file employees a waste of time. James Connor, the head of the supply department, stopped next to me. He was a man in his 40s, strongly built, with a red beard and a cheerful disposition. James was responsible for purchasing materials and equipment, knew all the suppliers in town, and was skilled at negotiating favorable prices. "Boss, looking great as always," he said loudly, slapping me on the shoulder. "I heard we're starting a new project in Hillsborough next week. It's going to be a lot of work." "Yes, Kyle mentioned that. 200 apartments, if I'm not mistaken." "Exactly. I've already started negotiations with brick and concrete suppliers. I want to lock in prices before the winter rates go up." "You're right, James. Experience shows that it's better to overpay for storage than to buy materials at inflated prices later." We discussed the logistical details of the future project. James was an experienced specialist who knew how to calculate needs months in advance. Such people formed the backbone of the company, professionals who did their jobs well and without unnecessary fuss. We were joined by Marcus Davis, one of our leading civil engineers, a 38-year-old black man and Stanford graduate. He specialized in complex technical solutions. Marcus joined the company 5 years ago and quickly established himself as an indispensable specialist in non-standard projects. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," he said with a slight Southern accent. "I wanted to report on the completion of the calculations for the foundation of the shopping center in Milwaukee. All parameters are normal, and we can begin excavation work." "That's excellent news, Marcus. What about the permit for connecting utilities?" "The documents were submitted to the city administration last week. They promised to review them by the end of the month." "Good. If any problems arise, let me know. I have contacts at City Hall who can help speed up the process." Marcus nodded gratefully. He understood the value of the connections and experience he had accumulated over decades of working in the industry. Young professionals often underestimate the importance of the human factor in business, thinking that technical competence is everything. At 7:30 in the evening, Kyle entered the hall accompanied by Tiffany and Cheryl. My son looked impressive in a dark blue suit and thin striped tie. Tall, athletic, with wavy brown hair and regular features, He gave the impression of a successful businessman. Next to him was Tiffany in an elegant black dress and pearl necklace, followed by Cheryl in a strict gray suit. I watched them walk through the hall greeting employees. Kyle smiled, shook hands, and asked about their work. But there was a certain formality to it all. He played the role of a leader, but he didn't experience the same genuine joy in interacting with people that I did. For him, the employees were a resource to be used wisely, not a team of like-minded people. Tiffany kept her distance, responding to greetings with a polite smile, but not engaging in long conversations. She clearly felt like a stranger in this company of simple workers. Her world consisted of galleries, restaurants, and country clubs, not construction sites and design offices. From time to time, she glanced at her watch, making it clear that she would prefer to spend the evening somewhere else. Cheryl, on the other hand, carefully studied the situation, as if assessing each person in terms of their usefulness for future plans. She greeted people reservedly, but remembered their names and positions, mentally mapping out the influence within the company. This woman did nothing without a reason. Every action served a specific purpose. She studied people like a chess player studies the pieces on the board. When our eyes met, I headed toward my son. I had to say hello to maintain the appearance of family unity in front of the employees. People shouldn't know about our differences. It has a negative effect on the morale of the team. Kyle, good evening, I said, extending my hand. Hi, Dad, he replied without much warmth, shaking my hand briefly. Tiffany, you look beautiful, I said to my daughter-in-law. Thank you, Wesley. She smiled stiffly, as if performing an unpleasant duty. Cheryl nodded dryly without saying a word. Her gaze revealed a poorly concealed contempt. To her, I was a relic of the past who stood in the way of progressive ideas. She looked at me as if I were an obstacle that needed to be circumvented or eliminated. How are things at the office? I asked Kyle, trying to strike up at least a formal conversation. Everything's fine. We've signed a contract to build a new residential complex in Hillsborough. It's a 200-apartment project. That's good news. Who's the architect? An outside firm. We decided to work with new partners to expand our network of contacts. I was surprised. Usually we handled such projects with our own architectural department. Stephen Harrison and his team did an excellent job with residential construction. Why pay intermediaries when you can do everything yourself? Why didn't you use Stephen? He has a lot of experience in residential construction. Dad, we live in the 21st century. We need to be open to new ideas and approaches. Our department is too conservative. Conservative? I asked. Stephen has created several excellent projects in recent years. The projects are good, but the style is outdated. Modern buyers want something fresh and unusual. Kyle spoke in a calm voice, but I could sense his mother-in-law's influence behind his words. It was Cheryl who had convinced him that everything needed to be changed, regardless of experience and tradition. For her, any innovation was good in itself, regardless of its practicality. I understand, I said, not wanting to argue in front of other people. Good luck with the new project. Thanks, Kyle replied and turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. I stepped aside, feeling bitter about this cold exchange. In the past, my son and I could spend hours discussing work issues, sharing ideas, and planning future projects. Now every word came with difficulty, as if he was afraid of saying something unnecessary or appearing too friendly. Watching Cheryl, I noticed how she behaved at the event. She wasn't just present, she was actively studying the situation, memorizing who was talking to whom, who had authority among colleagues, and who might be useful in the future. From time to time, she whispered something in Tiffany's ear, and Tiffany nodded and also began to look more closely at those around her. Cheryl paid particular attention to key company employees, chief specialists, department heads, people who had a real influence on work processes. She understood that effective management requires knowledge of the informal power structure and an understanding of who actually makes the decisions. When Cheryl talked to Stephen Harrison, I saw how attentively she listened to his story about current projects. She asked questions about the department's plans, new technologies, and development prospects. Stephen answered willingly, unaware that his words could be used against him in the future. Similarly, Cheryl talked to Patricia Wilson, finding out about the company's financial situation, cost structure, and the profitability of various areas. The accountant, accustomed to candor in work matters, shared information without thinking about the consequences. I understood that Cheryl was gathering data for future changes in the company. She was studying weaknesses, looking for opportunities for optimization, and planning personnel changes. All this was done methodically and professionally, as befits someone with a background in business administration. Tiffany wasn't sitting idle either. She talked to the employees' wives, finding out about their family circumstances, financial situation, and plans for the future. This information could be useful for understanding people's motivations, their vulnerabilities, and ways to influence them. Meanwhile, Kyle continued to play the role of a gracious host, but I noticed how he periodically glanced at his wife's mother, as if seeking approval for his actions. Cheryl would nod or shake her head slightly, letting him know whether he was behaving appropriately with a particular person. At that moment, soft music began to play, and the maitre d' invited everyone to take their seats at the tables. The guests began to sit down according to a prearranged plan. I headed for the table of guests of honor, where I traditionally sat to the right of the CEO as the company's founder and chairman of the board of founders. The key figures of the company were already seated at the main table. Kyle in the center as CEO, next to him, seats for Tiffany and me, then Stephen Harrison, Patricia Wilson, James Connor, and their spouses. It was a traditional arrangement that reflected the hierarchy and emphasized the importance of each participant. Taking my usual seat, I looked around the room. Employees were sitting at round tables, chatting animatedly and raising glasses of champagne. The atmosphere was friendly and festive. People were enjoying the opportunity to socialize in an informal setting, celebrate the successes of the past year, and share their plans for the future. The waiters began serving the first courses, and the room filled with the aroma of baked salmon and herb sauces. I tried the shrimp salad, but my appetite was poor. Too many thoughts were swirling around in my head. At the neighboring tables, employees chatted cheerfully, shared news, and laughed at their colleagues' jokes. This relaxed atmosphere has always been the main advantage of our corporate parties. Kyle sat next to me and made small talk with the top specialists. He talked about plans for the coming year, mentioned promising projects, and asked people's opinions on various issues. Outwardly, everything looked normal. My son was playing the role of an attentive leader who values the experience of his subordinates. But I sensed something artificial in his behavior. Kyle seemed to be putting on a show, saying the right words and displaying the right emotions. Behind this mask lay irritation, impatience, and a desire to get the formalities over with as quickly as possible. This became especially noticeable when one of the company's veterans began telling stories from the past. "Remember, Mr. Kyle, how we built that first shopping center in Beaverton," said Roger Coleman, waving his fork. "Your father carried bags of cement himself when the loaders didn't show up for work, and during lunch break, he taught us how to read blueprints correctly." "Yes, those were interesting times," Kyle replied politely but without enthusiasm. "And how Mr. Carter and I sat up until midnight recalculating the estimate," James Connor chimed in. "We checked each item 3 times so that the customer would have nothing to complain about." Kyle nodded and smiled, but I could see that these memories weighed heavily on him. He didn't want to hear about how the company was founded, how his father overcame difficulties, how the foundations for future success were laid. For him, it was ancient history that had no bearing on today's business. Tiffany sat to her husband's left and tried hard to appear interested in what was going on. She smiled, nodded, and asked polite questions about the work. But it was obvious that she found it all extremely boring. From time to time, she would glance at her watch or take out her phone to check her messages. She felt particularly uncomfortable when the conversation turned to the technical details of construction. The names of materials, construction terms, and engineering solutions were all Greek to her. Tiffany had a liberal arts education and had never been interested in manufacturing issues. "What are your plans for implementing new technologies?" Stephen Harrison asked Kyle. "Many companies already use 3D modeling at all stages of design." "We are considering various options," his son replied evasively. "We need to weigh all the pros and cons and evaluate the return on investment." "I can prepare a detailed analysis," the architect offered. "I have contacts at firms that have already implemented these systems." "Thank you, Stephen. We will definitely consider your proposal," but I knew that no analysis would be conducted. Under the influence of his mother-in-law, Kyle considered his own specialists insufficiently competent to make serious decisions. He preferred to consult with outside experts who supposedly had a better understanding of current trends. Cheryl was also sitting at the main table. A seat had been added for her at the last minute, formally as the mother of his daughter-in-law, but in fact as an unofficial advisor to the CEO. She listened attentively to all the conversations, occasionally interjecting comments, but mostly remained silent and observed. I noticed that Cheryl was paying particular attention to people's reactions to Kyle's words. When my son expressed an idea, she watched the faces of the listeners, noting who agreed, who was skeptical, and who openly objected. These observations helped her understand the balance of power in the team and identify potential allies and opponents. Cheryl looked at me particularly intently. Every time I expressed an opinion on a particular issue, she studied the reactions of those around me. Who supported my words? Who disagreed with them? Who remained neutral? She recorded all of this in her memory for further analysis. When the main course was served, beef with vegetables and a wine sauce, the conversation turned to the results of the past year. Patricia Wilson talked about financial indicators. James Conner talked about reducing material costs, and Stephen Harrison talked about new architectural solutions. All of this was positive news, demonstrating the company's stable development. The office building project in the city center was particularly successful, said Patricia. The profit exceeded the target by 18%. The client was very satisfied with the quality of the work and the delivery time. It's a credit to the whole team, Stephen replied modestly. Although it's worth noting Mr. Carter's role in negotiations with the client, his reputation and connections played a key role. When these words were spoken, I noticed Cheryl lean over to Kyle and whisper something in his ear. My son listened attentively, nodded several times, then glanced furtively in my direction. I saw irritation in his eyes. He clearly didn't like the fact that employees were emphasizing my role in the company's success. Of course, the experience of the older generation is very important, Kyle said after a pause. But we must look to the future, develop, and not rest on our laurels. The modern market requires new approaches. These words sounded like a veiled criticism of my working methods. Kyle was essentially saying that past achievements were irrelevant and that we needed to completely rethink our business principles. Some employees exchanged glances, sensing the hidden tension in the air. Cheryl nodded with satisfaction. This was exactly the reaction she was looking for. She needed to show those present that Kyle was ready to radically change the company's policy, abandon outdated traditions and methods. Gradually, people must get used to the idea that the era of the founder is coming to an end. After the main course, the waiters brought dessert, chocolate cake with berries and whipped cream. At the same time, a projector and screen were brought into the hall for the presentation of the year's results. This part of the program was always very important. We showed photos of completed projects, thanked the best employees, and announced plans for the future. The maitre d' approached our table and quietly asked Kyle, "Mr. Carter, when should we start the official part? And who will speak first?" Traditionally, I opened the ceremony with a speech about the results of the year. It was an important moment that all employees, especially the company's veterans, had been waiting for. I talked about our achievements, thanked people for their hard work, and outlined prospects for development. My speech set the tone for the entire event, but before Kyle could answer, Cheryl whispered something in his ear again. She spoke quickly and insistently, pointing in my direction with her eyes. I couldn't make out the words, but from the expression on my mother-in-law's face, I could tell she was persuading her son to change the program for the event. Kyle listened, frowned, and hesitated. It was clear that he was not entirely sure about the proposed course of action, but Cheryl's influence proved stronger than his doubts. Gradually, his face took on a determined expression. "Today's program will be a little different," Kyle said to the maitre d', but loud enough for his tablemates to hear. "I will open the official part myself and present the company's new development strategy." Stephen Harrison raised his eyebrows in surprise. He knew about the company's traditions and did not expect such changes. Patricia Wilson also looked puzzled. They exchanged glances but said nothing. It would have been inappropriate to argue with the boss in public. I felt a pang of disappointment but tried not to show it. As CEO, Kyle had the right to change the format of the event. Perhaps he really did have important information that needed to be communicated to the employees first. "What about Mr. Carter's traditional speech?" Dorothy Freeman asked cautiously. People are really looking forward to it. Of course, my father will also speak, Kyle replied after a short pause. But first, we need to talk about the new directions we're taking. Cheryl nodded approvingly. The plan was coming to fruition. She had succeeded in getting Kyle to take the initiative, pushing his father into the background. It was an important symbolic step, demonstrating a shift in priorities within the company. Tiffany also looked pleased with what was happening. For her, any action that emphasized her husband's independence from his father-in-law's influence was positive. She was tired of Kyle constantly being compared to his father, called a continuer of traditions instead of an independent leader. The maitre d' nodded and walked away to prepare the technical equipment. The waiters began clearing the dishes and glasses from the tables, making room for the presentation. The conversations in the hall gradually died down. The guests understood that the formal part of the evening was approaching. I sat and watched the preparations, feeling a growing tension. Something told me that tonight would not be like any other night. Cheryl was clearly planning some kind of action aimed at discrediting my authority. Otherwise, why would she have been so insistent on convincing Kyle to change the program? At the neighboring tables, the employees also noticed the change in atmosphere. Roger Coleman glanced anxiously in our direction, and Brandon Kelly watched the preparations for the presentation with confusion. People sensed that something unusual was happening, but they didn't understand what it was. Dorothy Freeman tried to talk to me several times, but I responded with monosyllables. My mind was preoccupied with trying to figure out what Cheryl was planning. This woman did nothing spontaneously. Every step she took was calculated and aimed at achieving a specific goal. When the technicians finished setting up the equipment, Kyle got up from the table and headed for the makeshift podium. He looked determined, but I noticed a slight tension in his movements. My son was clearly nervous. He was about to do something he wasn't mentally prepared for. Cheryl watched him with an approving gaze. She remained seated at the table, but her whole posture expressed readiness for action. Like a predator that had been waiting a long time for the right moment to attack and had finally gotten its chance. Silence fell over the room. The employees turned toward the podium, waiting for the speech to begin. Many of them were anticipating the traditional ceremony with a speech by the company's founder, awards for the best employees, and an announcement of plans for the future. They did not yet know that the usual order of things was about to change forever. Kyle picked up the microphone and glanced around the quiet hall. All eyes were on him. The employees were waiting for the formal part of the evening to begin. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and began to speak with the confident voice of a leader. Dear colleagues, today is a special day for our company. We are summing up the results of a successful year and looking to the future with optimism. Over the past 12 months, we have completed 18 major projects, increased profits by 14%, and expanded our staff of qualified specialists. The room responded with polite applause. People listened attentively, but I sensed some confusion in their eyes. They were used to the company founder opening the corporate event and the CEO speaking after him. The change in tradition puzzled the company's veterans. But past successes are only the foundation for future achievements, Kyle continued. The modern construction market requires flexibility, innovation, and a readiness for change. We cannot afford to rest on our laurels or rely solely on proven methods. In these words, I heard familiar themes: the influence of Cheryl and her theories about the need for radical change. My son was repeating the ideas his mother-in-law had been instilling in him for months. He spoke of modernization as an unconditional good, without considering the risks and possible losses. Next year will bring serious changes, Kyle announced. New design technologies, modern management methods, partnerships with leading architectural firms. We will open a branch in Seattle and start working with federal customers. The plans sounded ambitious, but I knew that they were not based on calculations and analysis, but on Cheryl's desire to prove her competence. Expanding into another state requires enormous resources, knowledge of local legislation, and established relationships with suppliers. Enthusiasm alone is not enough for this. The employees listened with interest, but some exchanged concerned glances. Roger Coleman frowned. As a practitioner, he understood the difficulties of implementing such plans. Stephen Harrison also looked skeptical. The architect knew that working with outside firms could create coordination problems. Of course, any change requires courage and determination, Kyle said. You have to be able to abandon outdated approaches, even if they seem familiar and safe. The future belongs to those who are willing to take risks and experiment. I knew these words were directed at me. My son was essentially declaring my methods obsolete and my experience a hindrance to progress. He did this publicly, in front of all the employees who knew and respected my role in building the company. After a 20-minute speech, Kyle thanked the audience for their attention and announced a break. Waiters began serving coffee and cognac, and people got up from their tables to stretch their legs and discuss what they had heard. Lively conversations could be heard throughout the hall. I also got up and headed for the podium. Traditionally, after the CEO's speech, the floor was given to the company's founder. My speeches were always less formal. I talked about people, thanked them for their work, and shared memories of the difficulties we had overcome together. Approaching the microphone, I waited for the hall to calm down a little. People gradually returned to their seats, preparing to listen to the second part of the program. Many smiled at me. They knew that warm words about the team and the company's family traditions were about to be spoken. "Dear friends," I began, "30 years ago, when we founded this company, I could not have dreamed of such success. Back then, there were 4 of us, 2 engineers, a secretary, and me. We worked in a rented house and dreamed of having our own office." Dorothy Freeman smiled and waved her hand. She remembered those days better than anyone. Roger Coleman also nodded approvingly. The company's veterans loved to hear stories about the firm's early days. It strengthened corporate solidarity. "But our greatest asset has always been our people," I continued. "Talented professionals who were not afraid of difficulties and believed in the common cause. Every building we have constructed is the result of collective labor, mutual assistance, and professional pride." I heard quick footsteps behind me. I looked back and saw Kyle walking decisively toward the podium. His expression was stern, his eyes cold with anger. He looked like a man who had made a final decision. "Dad, enough," he said loudly, so that the microphone picked up every word. "Stop this charade." The room fell silent. People didn't understand what was happening and looked at us in bewilderment. No one expected such a public conflict between father and son. The waiters froze with their trays in their hands and the guests stopped talking. "What do you mean?" I asked, still standing at the microphone. "You're embarrassing me in front of my employees," Kyle shouted, snatching the microphone from me. "Your sentimental speeches about the past are preventing people from focusing on the future. We're trying to build a modern company, and you're dragging us back." My son's words hit me like a slap in the face. He spoke with such fury as if I were his worst enemy, not the father who had given him the fruits of 30 years of labor. His voice was filled with hatred that he had been harboring for months. "Kyle, calm down," I tried to reason with him. "We're family." "Family?" He laughed maliciously. "You've forgotten your place, Dad. I'm the boss here, and you're a retiree who gets in the way of work. Stop pretending that the company still belongs to you." The employees sat spellbound, not knowing how to react to what was happening. Many looked down, feeling uncomfortable with the family scene. Dorothy Freeman covered her mouth with her hand. Roger Coleman clenched his fists. They did not expect the man they respected to be humiliated in public. "Enough!" Kyle shouted, seeing that I wanted to say something. "Get off the podium! Your time is up!" He grabbed me by the sleeve of my jacket and roughly pushed me aside. I barely managed to stay on my feet. My son was younger and stronger than me. The humiliation was complete. I was driven away like an annoying visitor who was disrupting an important event. At that moment, Cheryl approached the podium. She walked confidently, with a triumphant smile on her face. The plan she had been hatching for months was finally coming to fruition. My mother-in-law had achieved what she wanted, the public discrediting of my authority. "Kyle is right," she said, taking the microphone. "The company needs modern leadership, not nostalgic memories. I will help him implement a new development strategy." Cheryl spoke calmly, but there was a metallic edge to her voice. She had finally gotten what she wanted, the opportunity to run a serious business. Now she didn't need to act through her son-in-law. She could openly declare her ambitions. "Everyone, please return to your seats," she announced. "We will continue with the program." Kyle took my arm and led me to the head table, but not to my usual place to his right, but to the far end of the table where the junior managers sat. He demonstratively pushed my chair aside. "Mom Cheryl will be sitting next to me," he announced loudly so that everyone present could hear. She will be helping me run the company." Cheryl walked majestically to the vacant chair and sat down in the seat that had been mine for 27 years. She looked around the room with the gaze of a victor. The old order had been overthrown, and a new era had begun. My mother-in-law had achieved complete victory over her rival. I stood at the far end of the table, not knowing what to do. Sitting in my assigned seat among the ordinary guests meant accepting humiliation, but leaving the room was also impossible. It would look like an admission of defeat. The employees watched what was happening with horror and bewilderment. They saw the man who had created the company being publicly insulted and expelled from his place of honor. Many did not know how to behave. Supporting me meant conflict with the new management. Roger Coleman got up from his table and headed toward me. His face was grim. The foreman couldn't stand by and watch the man he respected being humiliated. But Kyle stopped him with a gesture. "Roger, go back to your seat," his son ordered. "This is a family matter. It doesn't concern you." "But Mr. Carter," the foreman began. "Mr. Carter is me," Kyle interrupted him sharply. "And my father is just Wesley, a retiree who no longer makes decisions in the company." Roger clenched his fists but obeyed the order. He understood that open defiance would cost him his job. The foreman slowly returned to his desk, giving me a sympathetic look. Dorothy Freeman sat with teary eyes, unable to believe what was happening. To her, I was not just a boss, but a person who had given her a job in a difficult time, supported her during her husband's illness, and helped with her grandchildren's education. Seeing my humiliation was a personal tragedy for her. Stephen Harrison also looked shocked. The architect understood that he was witnessing a historic change of power in the company. The old guard had been crushed, and the new owners were asserting themselves with the most brutal methods. "Well, Dad, take a seat," Kyle said, pointing to a distant spot. "Or don't you want to stay at our party anymore?" There was a poorly concealed challenge in his voice. My son was essentially offering me a choice: accept the humiliation or leave the event. Either option meant complete defeat and recognition of his authority. Cheryl watched the events unfold with poorly concealed satisfaction. She had achieved more than she had planned. She had not only pushed me into the background, but completely discredited me in the eyes of the employees. Now no one would dare question her right to run the company. Tiffany also looked pleased with what was happening. For her, it was a victory over her father-in-law, who was supposedly interfering with her family's happiness. She finally saw her husband as strong and independent, ready to defend his interests by any means necessary. I slowly made my way to the designated spot, feeling dozens of eyes on me. Every step was difficult. My pride resisted such humiliation. But there was no choice. Leaving the hall would mean a final break with my son and the loss of all influence in the company. Sitting down in my assigned seat, I looked around the hall. Most of the employees avoided meeting my gaze. They were ashamed of what was happening. Some whispered among themselves, discussing what they had seen. The festive atmosphere was completely ruined. Kyle returned to the microphone and tried to restore order. He talked about plans for the future, new projects, and prospects for development. But people listened distractedly. All their thoughts were occupied with the dramatic scene they had witnessed. Cheryl sat next to him, showing everyone her new status. She periodically whispered something to her brother-in-law, gave advice, pointed to specific people in the room. My mother-in-law felt like she was in charge and did not hide her triumph. The event program continued, but the magic of the corporate party was destroyed. The traditional awards for the best employees, anniversary congratulations, and expressions of gratitude all took place in a tense atmosphere. People understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. I sat at the far end of the table and watched as the rest of the corporate party program unfolded. Kyle continued his speech, talking about expansion plans in Seattle and new partnership agreements. Cheryl nodded from time to time, showing her approval of his words. The employees listened politely, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. They still hadn't recovered from the shock of the public scandal. Waiters served cognac and cigars, trying to maintain a festive atmosphere. But the conversations at the tables were hushed, and people kept glancing in my direction with sympathy or embarrassment. The company veterans were particularly upset by what had happened. Dorothy wiped her eyes with a handkerchief several times, while Roger sat silently, clutching his glass. Every minute I spent in that humiliating place made me feel worse. Sitting among second-rate managers after 27 years of leading the company was unbearable. Kyle had gotten his way. He had turned me into an outsider at the party he himself had organized. When the award ceremony for the best employees of the year began, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. Watching Cheryl present certificates of honor to people I had known since their first day on the job was beyond my strength. This woman had taken it upon herself to thank those who had built the company with their own hands for their hard work. Quietly getting up from the table, I headed for the exit. Several people noticed my departure, but no one dared to follow me. Everyone understood that any support for me could be interpreted by the new management as insubordination. I did not condemn them for such caution. Everyone had a family to feed. The hotel lobby was quiet and cool. The sounds of music and muffled voices drifted from the banquet hall, but here I could finally catch my breath and collect my thoughts. I walked over to the panoramic window and looked out at the lights of Portland spread out below. I had lived in this city my whole life, built dozens of buildings and created jobs for hundreds of people, and now my own son had kicked me out like a nuisance. The doorman nodded sympathetically at me. He had worked at the hotel for many years and remembered the days when I was an honored guest at all events. Now I was leaving the building like an ordinary visitor, with no one to see me off or invite me back. The December air refreshed my flushed face. It was frosty outside, but I was in no hurry to get into the car. I wanted to walk, to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what had happened. Portland looked especially beautiful in the days leading up to Christmas. Shop windows sparkled with festive lights. Passers-by hurried home with gifts, and the air was filled with anticipation of the holiday. I walked slowly along familiar streets, remembering how 30 years ago I had wandered these same places, dreaming of starting my own business. Back then, I was full of plans and energy, believing that I could build something significant and pass it on to my children. It seemed natural that my son would continue his father's work, developing and strengthening the family tradition. But reality turned out to be cruel. Kyle not only refused to follow my principles, he publicly humiliated me, showing everyone that he considered my methods outdated and my experience an obstacle to development. Cheryl's influence turned my son into a stranger who saw me only as an obstacle to power. When I reached my neighborhood, I stopped near the company's first office, the very wooden house where Dorothy, two engineers, and I had started. Now it housed a souvenir shop, but I remembered every corner of that building. Here I had spent sleepless nights poring over blueprints, welcomed my first customers, and dreamed of future prosperity. At the time, it seemed that the main difficulties were behind us. We had received our first orders, established relationships with suppliers, and formed a team of reliable employees. I could not have imagined that 3 decades later, my own son would reject everything I had built and choose a path that would lead to the destruction of family ties. When I got home, I went to my study and poured myself a whiskey. Alcohol usually helped me relax after a hard day, but today it only intensified the bitterness of the humiliation I had experienced. I sat down in my favorite armchair and tried to sort out my feelings. Anger, disappointment, and resentment mixed together in a tangle of painful emotions. On the desk lay company documents, financial reports, project plans, contracts with suppliers. Just yesterday, all of this seemed like a part of my life, an area where my opinion mattered. Now these papers had become a reminder of lost influence and shattered hopes. It was especially painful to think about how the employees would react to what had happened. Many of them had worked for the company for decades, knew the history of its creation, and respected the traditions and principles that I had established. Today, they witnessed my public humiliation and realized that the old ways no longer worked. Dorothy, who had been with me since the very beginning, saw the man who had given her a job and support being driven from his place of honor. Roger, who started as a simple worker and became a leading foreman thanks to my trust, realized that loyalty to the former management could cost him his career. Stephen, Patricia, James, Marcus, all these talented professionals learned that in the new company, it is not professional merit that is valued, but the ability to adapt to Cheryl's wishes. Experience and dedication no longer guarantee stability, only a willingness to serve the new bosses matters. I got up and walked over to the bookcase where the photo albums with the company's history were kept. Leafing through the pages, I saw how the first buildings were constructed, how the team of employees grew, how the business developed. Many of the photos showed little Kyle. He helped on construction sites, participated in corporate events, and was proud of his father's company's successes. When exactly did this boy turn into a cold careerist who considers family traditions an obstacle to his ambitions? Where is the line beyond which the influence of his wife and mother-in-law became stronger than his childhood memories and his father's love? Why did Kyle choose confrontation instead of cooperation? Maybe I am to blame for what happened. I handed over control of the company to my son too early, without preparing him for the responsibility. I overestimated the strength of family ties and underestimated the influence of outsiders. I believed that blood ties were more important than material interests, but reflecting on past mistakes did not change the current state of affairs. Kyle made his choice, publicly announcing his break with his father's legacy. Cheryl got what she wanted, the opportunity to run a large business. Tiffany saw in her husband a strong leader who was not afraid to go against family traditions. Now I had to decide how to respond to what had happened. I could have accepted the situation, quietly stepped aside and watched as the new management changed the company as they saw fit. That path was the least painful, no conflict, no stress, a peaceful retirement away from business problems. But inside me, another feeling was growing, a cold determination not to let what had happened go unpunished. Kyle had crossed all boundaries by humiliating me in front of people who respected me. Cheryl celebrated her victory, thinking she had easily gotten rid of an inconvenient competitor. They were both wrong to think that the old wolf would give up without a fight. I sat in my chair for a long time, thinking about possible courses of action. Direct confrontation was futile. Formally, Kyle had the right to do everything he did. Emotional appeals to conscience would not work either. My son had already proven that family feelings meant nothing to him, but I still had other levers of influence that Kyle and Cheryl did not even suspect. In 30 years of work, I had accumulated not only experience and connections, but also certain documents that could radically change the balance of power in the company. Time was on my side. The more confident the new owners felt, the more painful the blow would be. Late in the evening, I finally made my decision. It wasn't easy. Too much would have to be destroyed. Too many people would be affected. But there was no other way out. Kyle and Cheryl had declared war, and now they would get a response in full accordance with the rules they themselves had established. Revenge was not to be a momentary outburst of anger, but a carefully planned operation. It would take time to prepare all the necessary documents, conduct the necessary negotiations, and make sure every step was correct. Kyle would have time to enjoy his victory, to believe in his own invulnerability. And then he would learn the price of humiliating the person who had given him everything. Closing the photo album, I returned to my desk and took a folder of documents out of the drawer. It contained papers that could change the fate not only of the company, but of everyone associated with it. Tomorrow a new game would begin, one whose rules only I knew. The next morning, I woke up with a clear head and a firm resolve. The night's sleep had brought not rest, but a final understanding of what needed to be done. There was no more time for reflection and doubt. The plan had matured and demanded immediate implementation. After showering and eating breakfast, I sat down at my desk and took out my notebook with phone numbers. The first thing I had to do was contact the person who could help me carry out my plan. Dennis Morgan, owner of Morgan Development, was an old acquaintance and, at the same time, a serious competitor in the Portland construction market. We met back in the 80s when we were both just starting our businesses, and since then we had maintained a complicated relationship. We respected each other's professionalism, but we were constantly competing for the same contracts. Dennis was 5 years younger than me, the son of Irish immigrants, a tough and pragmatic man. His company specialized in commercial construction and had expanded significantly in recent years, opening branches in Seattle and Sacramento. Morgan had always dreamed of taking over our firm, but I never gave him the opportunity. I dialed the number, waited for the secretary to answer, and asked to be connected to the director. Dennis was surprised by the call. We hadn't spoken in over 6 months since we last competed for a contract to build an office complex in the city center. We won that contract, which further intensified the rivalry between our companies. "Wesley, I didn't expect to hear your voice, Morgan said with a slight Irish accent. What's going on? Is someone in your family sick? Everyone is alive and well, Dennis, but I have a business proposal that might interest you. Can we meet today? A business proposal? He asked curiously. From you? That's something new. Usually we just get in each other's way when it comes to contracts. Today is not a normal day. Are you free at 1 o'clock? I can come to your office. Dennis agreed to the meeting, although his voice betrayed his confusion. He couldn't understand what could have prompted his longtime competitor to make a business proposal. In our many years of dealing with each other, this had never happened before. We had always been on opposite sides of the fence. The Morgan Development Office was located in a modern glass building in the city's business center. Unlike our office, everything here was high-tech. Steel structures, abstract paintings, designer furniture. Dennis always liked to impress clients with his outward glamour and technological innovations. The secretary showed me into the director's office, a spacious room with panoramic windows overlooking the river. Dennis greeted me warmly but cautiously. He was a short, stocky man with graying red hair and piercing green eyes. Over the years in the construction business, he had learned not to trust unexpected offers. Have a seat, Wesley. Would you like some coffee? He asked, pointing to a leather armchair in front of the desk. Thanks, I'd love some. How's it going? I heard you got the contract for the shopping center in Eugene. Yes, it's a good project. How are you doing? Is Kyle coping with management? There was no malice in his question, just professional curiosity about his competitor's business. Dennis didn't know about yesterday's events at the corporate party and was genuinely interested in his young colleague's successes. Kyle is trying to do business in a new way, I replied cautiously. But that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. Morgan leaned forward, intrigued. He understood that this concerned serious changes in a competing company, and such information was always of interest to a businessman. I'm ready to sell my stake in Carter and Associates, I said bluntly, without preamble. Dennis froze with his coffee cup in his hands, unable to believe what he was hearing. He hadn't expected such an offer even in his wildest dreams. Buying a stake in our company opened up unprecedented opportunities for him. Access to our clients, projects, and skilled personnel. Are you serious? He asked, putting his cup on the table. Sell my stake? What about Kyle, the family business? Kyle has his own plans for development, and I have mine. We see the future of the company differently. It's time to part ways. Morgan stood up and paced around the office, pondering the unexpected information. He was too experienced a businessman to immediately believe in such luck. Behind every unexpected offer lay pitfalls that needed to be carefully examined. What exactly is your stake? And why did you decide to sell it? 45%, I replied. The other 55% belongs to Kyle. As for the reasons, let's just say we had irreconcilable differences over the development strategy. 45%, Dennis repeated, and I saw his eyes light up with interest. That's a significant stake, enough to influence all of the company's decisions. Exactly. And combined with your experience and resources, that stake could be the basis for radical changes in the industry. Morgan returned to the table and took out a calculator. He began to calculate something, occasionally glancing at me with an appraising look. I understood that he was estimating the cost of the deal and the potential profit from acquiring such an asset. Is Kyle aware of your intentions? No, and he shouldn't be yet. It will be a surprise for him. I see, Dennis nodded. Family conflicts are a delicate matter, but I need to understand the legal aspects of the deal. Are there any restrictions on selling shares to third parties? I had anticipated this question and checked all the documents in advance. The company's charter did not contain any provisions on preemptive rights or the need to agree on the sale with other founders. This mistake was made when the company was founded, when Kyle and I trusted each other completely. There are no legal obstacles. I have the right to sell my share to any buyer without consulting my son. Excellent, Morgan said, a note of excitement in his voice. Now for the price. What kind of amount are we talking about? I named a figure that was slightly above the market value of the share, but not so high as to scare off a serious buyer. Dennis grimaced. The amount was significant even for his company, but I could see that he had already made a fundamental decision to buy. It's expensive, he said after a pause. But fair, considering the customer base, the company's reputation, the qualified staff. Yes, it's a reasonable price. I have one more condition, I added. The deal must be completed as quickly as possible, ideally within a week. A week? Morgan was surprised. That's very little time for such a large transaction. We need legal expertise, asset valuation, approval from the bank. I understand the complications, Dennis, but delay could lead to the deal falling through. Kyle will find out about my intentions sooner or later and try to interfere. Morgan nodded, understanding the logic of my reasoning. He was experienced enough to seize the moment when luck came his way. It would be foolish to miss such an opportunity because of bureaucratic red tape. All right, he said decisively. My team of lawyers will work around the clock. All the documents will be ready by the end of the week. But I'll need a little time to arrange the financing. How much? 2 days. During that time, I'll negotiate a loan with the bank and prepare the necessary documents. We shook hands, sealing our verbal agreement. Dennis was a man of his word. If he promised something, he always delivered. In 25 years in business, he had never once broken a promise. There's one more thing, I said. I would like to keep the information about the deal confidential until the time is right. Of course, all parties involved will sign non-disclosure agreements. Kyle will only find out about the sale after all the documents have been signed. The meeting lasted about an hour. We discussed the technical details of the deal, the timing of the due diligence, and the paperwork procedure. Dennis proved to be a knowledgeable and businesslike partner. He clearly understood all the nuances and did not try to bargain for additional benefits. As we said goodbye, Morgan once again emphasized the confidentiality of the agreement. Wesley, I appreciate your trust. I promise that no one will know about our plans until the official announcement. Thank you, Dennis. I think it will be beneficial for everyone, except those who consider me an old man past his prime. When I returned home, I felt a strange sense of relief. The most difficult part of the plan had been set in motion. Now all that remained was to wait for the lawyers to prepare the documents and the bankers to approve the financing. In a week, Kyle and Cheryl would learn a lesson about underestimating an experienced opponent. In the evening, I sat in my office for a long time, sorting through company documents. Tomorrow, a new phase of my life would begin. Without daily work, without responsibility for the fate of employees, without pride in the buildings I had constructed, but with the knowledge that justice had prevailed and that a lesson would be taught to those who deserved it. The ringing of the phone interrupted my thoughts. It was Dorothy Freeman. She had been trying to call me since morning to find out how I was feeling after yesterday's events. Wesley, dear, how are you feeling? I didn't sleep all night, thinking about what happened at the corporate party. Thanks for your concern, Dorothy. I'm fine. What Kyle did, it's terrible. Many employees are outraged. Roger even wanted to resign in protest. There's no need for that. People need jobs. Families need to live. Let everyone decide for themselves what to do. But it's not fair. You built this company, gave it the best years of your life, and then to be treated like this? Dorothy, don't worry, everything will work out. Sometimes life teaches us lessons we don't expect. I couldn't tell her about the deal that was in the works, but I wanted to reassure her. Dorothy was a good person, and I didn't want her to suffer because of someone else's ambitions. After talking to her, I was finally convinced that I had made the right decision. The people who had worked with me for many years did not deserve the humiliation they witnessed yesterday. Kyle and Cheryl had crossed all boundaries, and now they had to answer for their actions. The next few days were spent in tense anticipation. Dennis Morgan kept his word. His team of lawyers worked almost around the clock, preparing the documents for the deal. I received daily reports on the progress of the preparations. The bank had approved a loan secured by Morgan's company assets, independent experts were evaluating my share, and lawyers were studying all the legal aspects of the deal. On Wednesday, Dennis called and said that all the formalities were almost complete. The bank guarantees had been obtained, the estimated value of the stake had been confirmed, and the purchase agreement was ready to be signed. All that remained was to set a time for the final meeting and the official execution of the deal. We agreed to meet on Friday morning at the office of Robert Stewart, a notary public who had been handling large commercial transactions in Portland for many years. Stewart was known for his meticulousness and absolute reliability. None of the transactions he had ever handled had ever been challenged in court. On Thursday evening, I carefully reviewed all the documents relating to my share in the company for the last time. The articles of association, minutes of shareholders' meetings, financial reports for the last 5 years, all of this would pass into the hands of the new owner tomorrow. It was a strange feeling, handing over the results of 30 years of work to a man who, until recently, had been a competitor. But I had no doubts that it was the right decision. Kyle chose the path of confrontation himself, publicly humiliating me in front of the employees. Now he will learn a lesson about what it means to underestimate his father's experience and connections. Cheryl will also learn that her plans to run someone else's business can end in complete failure. On Friday morning, I arrived at the notary's office in the city center. The 19th century building, restored to preserve its historic appearance, was located near the courthouse and city hall. It was in places like this that deals were made that changed the fate of individuals and entire businesses. Robert Stewart met me in his office, a stately room with oak paneling, antique furniture, and portraits of famous lawyers on the walls. The notary was a man in his 60s with gray hair and attentive eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. His manner inspired confidence and respect. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," he said, shaking my hand. "Mr. Morgan is already here, so we can begin the proceedings." Dennis sat at a long table surrounded by his lawyers and financial advisors. He looked focused but satisfied. The deal he had been dreaming of for years was finally becoming a reality. Next to him lay a thick folder of documents, contracts, certificates, guarantees. "Wesley, good morning," he greeted me. "Ready for this historic moment?" "Absolutely, are you?" "More than ready. This is the best investment of my career." The notary invited everyone to sit down at the table and began to read the terms of the deal. 45% of the shares of Carter and Associates are transferred to Dennis Morgan for the sum of $3,800,000. The money will be transferred to my account immediately after the documents are signed and notarized. Morgan's lawyers checked all the documents again, verified my right to dispose of the shares, and clarified the details of the bank transfer. The procedure took over an hour. Every word was discussed and agreed upon. Every signature was made in the presence of witnesses. When all the documents were signed and certified by the notary, Dennis stood up and held out his hand to me. "Congratulations to both of us, Wesley. I think this is the beginning of a wonderful collaboration." "I hope you make good use of the opportunities you've acquired," I replied, shaking his hand. "You can be sure of that. I already have plans to integrate our companies and expand the business." The notary gave each of us copies of all the documents and confirmed that the deal was legally binding from the moment it was signed. Now Dennis Morgan owned almost half of the company I had spent 3 decades building. As I left the notary's office, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. On the one hand, justice had been served. Kyle and Cheryl would get what they deserved for their arrogance. On the other hand, I had just sold the business of my life and destroyed the family legacy I was so proud of. But I had no choice. My son had pushed me to take this step with his behavior at the corporate party. He wanted to get rid of his father's influence. Now he would have a much more serious partner in Dennis Morgan. When I got home, I found 3 messages from Kyle on my answering machine. He had been calling since morning, trying to find out where I was and why I had left home so early. My son's voice sounded worried. Apparently, one of his friends had seen me near the notary's office and told him about it. I didn't call him back. Kyle would find out what had happened soon enough. But for now, let him worry, trying to figure out what his father was up to. A little uncertainty would do him good. It would teach him not to make important decisions in the heat of the moment. Around noon, Dennis called. He had already met with his managers and discussed plans for integrating the 2 companies. Morgan intended to act quickly and decisively, not giving Kyle time to organize a counterattack. "I have a proposal," he said. "I want to hold a shareholders meeting tomorrow and officially announce the change of ownership. What do you think?" "Great idea. The sooner, the better." "Then I'll send Kyle a notice tonight. The meeting is scheduled for Monday at 10 a.m. in the conference room at your office." The rush was justified. As long as Kyle didn't know what was happening, he couldn't take any countermeasures. But as soon as he heard about the sale, he would try to find ways to challenge the deal or minimize its impact. On Sunday evening, I decided to tell my son what had happened myself. It was better for him to hear the news from his father than from an official notice. Besides, I wanted to see his reaction to this unexpected turn of events. I drove to Kyle's house. Their mansion in a prestigious neighborhood was brightly lit. Apparently, the family was spending Sunday evening at home. After parking the car, I walked to the front door and rang the bell. Tiffany opened the door. She looked surprised and not too pleased with the unexpected visit. After the events at the company party, the relationship between us had become even more strained, and my sister-in-law clearly preferred to avoid meeting me. "Wesley? What's going on?" she asked coldly. "I need to talk to Kyle. Is he home?" "Yes, but we're having dinner. Maybe we can talk tomorrow?" "It won't take long, but it's better to talk today." Tiffany reluctantly let me into the house. I walked into the living room, where Kyle, Cheryl, and my son's two daughters, 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Sophie, were sitting at the table. The girls squealed with delight when they saw their grandfather and rushed to hug me. "Grandpa, we haven't seen you in so long," Emma chirped. "Hello, princesses," I replied, hugging my granddaughters. "How's school?" Kyle looked at me warily. He understood that an unannounced visit on a Sunday meant something serious. We hadn't spoken since the company party, and my father's appearance in the family circle was unexpected. "Girls, go to your room and finish your homework," Cheryl said sternly. "The adults need to talk." Emma and Sophie reluctantly let me go and ran upstairs. I was left alone with three people who considered me a defeated enemy. They didn't know yet that the war was just beginning. "Sit down, Dad," Kyle said, pointing to a chair. "Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you. I won't be long." Cheryl sat down next to her son-in-law, demonstrating their unity. Tiffany settled into the far corner of the sofa, ready to watch the events unfold. All three expected me to apologize for my behavior or beg to be reinstated to my former position in the company. "I have some news that may interest you," I began calmly. "Today I sold my stake in Carter & Associates." Kyle turned pale. Cheryl leaned forward sharply. Tiffany stared at me in bewilderment. None of them expected to hear such a statement. "What?" my son asked, not believing what he had heard. "Sold? To whom?" "Dennis Morgan. 45% of the shares now belong to him." "That's impossible," Cheryl exclaimed. "You have no right to sell your stake without approval." "I do, and I already did. All the documents are signed and notarized." Kyle was silent, trying to comprehend what he had heard. His face gradually reddened with anger and shock. He understood that something catastrophic had happened that completely changed the balance of power in the company. "Why did you do that?" he finally asked in a hoarse voice. "You answered that question yourself at the corporate party," I replied calmly. "You said that I was disgracing you and hindering the development of the business. Now I won't be in your way anymore." "But this is a family business," Tiffany protested. "It was a family business until the son decided that his father was surplus to requirements in the family business." Cheryl stood up and began pacing the room, feverishly considering the consequences of my actions. She realized that all her plans had collapsed overnight. Instead of running the family business, she would now have to deal with Dennis Morgan, a tough and unscrupulous businessman. "Morgan will deceive you," she said. "He'll want complete control of the company." "Maybe, but that's not my problem anymore. I'm just a retiree who no longer makes business decisions." I stood up, ready to leave. The purpose of the visit had been achieved. My son and his family knew about the deal and understood its consequences. Tomorrow, another surprise awaited them: the official shareholders meeting. "Dad, wait!" Kyle shouted. "We can discuss everything and find a compromise." "The time for compromises passed on Friday at the corporate party. You made your choice then. Now I've made mine." As I left the house, I heard a heated discussion begin behind me. Kyle was yelling at his wife, Cheryl was trying to find a way out of the situation, and Tiffany was lamenting her ruined plans. But nothing could be changed now. The documents were signed, the money was transferred, and Dennis Morgan became a co-owner of the company. Monday morning brought the first real snow of winter. Large flakes slowly fell on the streets of Portland, covering the city with a white blanket. I stood at the window of my office and watched nature prepare for its winter hibernation. In an hour, a shareholders meeting would take place that would forever change the fate of the company founded 3 decades ago. At 9:30 in the morning, I arrived at the Carter & Associates office. The building looked the same as usual. None of the employees knew about the upcoming changes yet. The security guard greeted me warmly, and the secretary smiled and asked how I was doing. To them, I was still the founder and honorary chairman of the board of directors. Dennis Morgan was already waiting in the conference room, accompanied by his lawyer and CFO. They sat down at a long table, spreading out folders with documents in front of them. Morgan looked focused and confident, a man ready for an important business meeting. "Good morning, Wesley," he greeted me. "Ready for the final act?" "Absolutely, are you?" "I've been preparing for this day my entire career." Dorothy Freeman entered the conference room. She was responsible for keeping the minutes of the meeting in accordance with the company's bylaws. When she saw Dennis Morgan, Dorothy raised her eyebrows in surprise but said nothing. An experienced secretary, she understood that the presence of a competitor at a closed meeting meant something serious. Kyle appeared at exactly 10 o'clock. He looked exhausted and agitated. He had obviously spent a sleepless night trying to find a way out of the situation. My son was dressed in his best suit, as if he were preparing for important negotiations, but fatigue and stress were evident in his every movement. Tiffany and Cheryl followed him in. My daughter-in-law was tense, and my mother-in-law looked grim and determined. She clearly had no intention of giving up without a fight and was hoping to find a way to turn the situation to her advantage. "Dad, we need to talk before the meeting starts," Kyle said, approaching me. "All conversations after the meeting. We have a business meeting now." Kyle shot a hostile glance at Dennis Morgan, who was calmly studying the documents. There was tension between the two men, the young director and the experienced predator, preparing for a battle for control of the company. Dorothy declared the meeting open and read the agenda. The only item was a notice of a change in the composition of shareholders due to the sale of a stake, a formality that would take a few minutes but would change the rest of the lives of those present. "The floor is given to Wesley Carter," Dorothy said in a trembling voice. I stood up and glanced around at the assembled crowd. My son sat tensely, his fists clenched. Cheryl leaned forward, ready to object. Tiffany nervously fiddled with her purse. Dennis Morgan watched the proceedings with the interest of a professional gambler. "Dear shareholders," I began in a formal tone, "I would like to inform you that on Friday, December 12th, a deal was made to sell 45% of the shares of Carter and Associates. The buyer was Mr. Dennis Morgan, director of Morgan Development." Kyle stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "That's illegal! I didn't give my consent to sell my shares." "Your consent was not required," I replied calmly. "According to the company's charter, each shareholder has the right to dispose of their shares independently." Dennis Morgan stood up and handed Kyle copies of all the documents. "Everything has been done in accordance with the law," he said in a businesslike tone. "The transaction has been notarized and is fully legally binding." Kyle feverishly flipped through the pages, looking for any clue to challenge the deal, but the documents were flawlessly drafted. Every word checked by experienced lawyers, every signature notarized. "This is betrayal," he shouted, throwing the documents on the table. "You sold the family business to our competitors." "I sold my property to the highest bidder," I replied, "and it ceased to be a family business the moment you publicly humiliated me at the corporate party." Cheryl stood up and tried to take the initiative. "Mr. Morgan, what are your plans for managing the company? I hope you understand the importance of retaining the existing management team." Dennis looked at her with a cold smile. He knew perfectly well who was behind all the recent changes in the company and had no intention of standing on ceremony with the self-appointed advisor. "My plans concern only the company's shareholders," he said sharply. "All other issues will be resolved in the normal course of business. But I'm helping Kyle with management. Kyle will now be assisted by my company's professional management team. Outsiders will not be allowed access to management." Cheryl paled, realizing that all her ambitions had collapsed overnight. Months of preparation, a carefully crafted strategy to seize power, all of it had been in vain. Instead of managing the family business, she was about to return to her role as a housewife. Tiffany also realized the scale of the disaster. The family was losing control of the company, which was their main source of income and social status. Instead of being the wife of a successful businessman, she risked becoming the wife of a junior partner in someone else's corporation. "Dad, we can work this out," Kyle said pleadingly. "Cancel the deal. I'll give you back your seat on the board of directors. Apologize to the employees." "It's too late, son. Some actions cannot be corrected with apologies." Dennis Morgan took another folder out of his briefcase and placed it in front of Kyle. Now let's discuss the practicalities, he said briskly. Here's the plan for restructuring the company. Some departments will be merged with the corresponding divisions of Morgan Development, some employees will be given new positions, and some will receive severance pay. Kyle opened the folder and began to read. With each line, his face grew paler. Morgan's plan called for a radical overhaul of the entire company structure, the replacement of key managers, a change of office, and even a change of company name. This isn't restructuring, it's a takeover, he exclaimed. It's modern business practice, Morgan replied calmly. Efficiency is paramount. Those who can benefit the merged company will stay. The rest will receive decent compensation. What about me? Kyle asked with a trembling voice. You will remain a junior partner with a 55% stake, but operational management will be transferred to my team. You simply do not have enough experience to run a business of this scale. Kyle clutched his head, realizing that all his ambitions had been completely shattered. Instead of being the independent head of a successful company, he was becoming a junior partner with no real power. All his dreams of building a business empire were shattered. Cheryl watched in horror. Her plan to control someone else's company had not only failed, it had turned into a disaster for the whole family. Instead of influence and power, she had suffered complete defeat and public humiliation. This is all your fault, she shouted, pointing her finger at me. You set this up on purpose. I just took advantage of the opportunity I was given, I replied calmly. Kyle wanted to get rid of his father's influence. Now instead of his father, he has his partner, Dennis Morgan. Tiffany began to cry, realizing that her family's well-being had been destroyed. A beautiful life in a prestigious neighborhood, social gatherings, expensive purchases, all of that was now in question. Her husband had gone from being a successful entrepreneur to a dependent companion. Kyle stood up and tried to walk to the window, but suddenly staggered. His face turned deathly pale. His eyes rolled back. He grabbed the wall, trying to stay on his feet, but his strength left him. Kyle, Tiffany cried, rushing to her husband. Her son slowly sank to the floor unconscious. Cheryl rushed to him and began rubbing his temples, trying to bring him round. Dorothy called an ambulance. Dennis Morgan watched the scene with professional calm. I looked at my unconscious son and felt a strange emptiness. Revenge had been served, justice had prevailed, a lesson had been taught. Kyle got what he deserved for his behavior, but for some reason, this moment did not bring me the satisfaction I had expected. A few minutes later, Kyle came to. He slowly sat up, leaning against the wall, and looked around with a cloudy gaze. Reality hit him with renewed force. The company was lost, his plans were ruined, and his future was uncertain. The meeting is adjourned, said Dennis Morgan, gathering his documents. We'll discuss the details of the integration tomorrow. Kyle, I'll see you in my office at 10 o'clock. He left the conference room, leaving the devastated family alone with their grief. Dorothy also left, realizing that she had witnessed a family tragedy. I was left alone with my son, daughter-in-law, and mother-in-law. Kyle slowly got up from the floor and sat down on a chair. He stared into space, unable to believe what had happened. All his ambitions, all his plans to build an independent business had collapsed in an hour. Why did you do it, Dad? He asked in a quiet voice. You gave me the answer yourself at the corporate party. You said I was embarrassing you and hindering the company's development. Now I'm not hindering anyone anymore. I got up and headed for the exit. Everything had been said, all accounts settled. 30 years of creation ended in one day of destruction, but that's often how life is. People choose their own destiny and then are surprised by the consequences. As I left the building, I looked back at the office of the company I had built with my own hands. Tomorrow, a new life would begin here, under the leadership of Dennis Morgan. Many employees would lose their jobs, traditions would be forgotten, and the family atmosphere would disappear forever. But the choice was not mine to make. Kyle and Cheryl themselves destroyed what had been built over decades. They wanted power and got it, along with all the problems that came with it. The lesson was harsh but fair. As I got into the car, I felt a strange calmness. The anger had passed, the resentment had subsided, the desire for revenge had been exhausted. All that remained was the fatigue of an elderly man and the understanding that some mistakes cannot be corrected.